Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elvira Lazar, and I'm so pleased that so many people can join us on this webinar today. We've got almost 300 people joining us, and today will be the first of 6 webinars that we are presenting, and each session will focus on a particular topic area of road safety, and today we're talking about vulnerable road users, and in particular cyclists and motorcyclists. This event is a collaboration between AITPM, which is the Australian Institute of Traffic Planning and Management, the Australasian College of Road Safety, ACRS Victoria chapter, and RACV, where I am the Senior Policy Advisor. So this session today is being recorded, and presenters will also make their slides available at the end of the session, and those will be able to be accessed via the AITPM and ACRS websites following this session. So please make sure that your microphones are muted and the cameras are off for the duration of this webinar. Now, I'll just run through some sponsors before we move on to today's session. So AITPM is very proud to be sponsored by their national sponsors, Austraffic and WSP. Their national sponsors, Cardno, VLC, Connexus, SMEC, Matrix, Monash University. And the Victorian sponsors, the Department of Transport, RACV, O'Brien Traffic, SALT, Traffic Works, and Traffics Group. ACRS would also like to acknowledge the global goals, the Decade of Action for Road Safety, and also the Sarah Group. So this event is a collaboration between AITPM, ACRS, and RACV. We offer affordable memberships, and there are many benefits that are attached to these memberships, such as delivering seminars like this. And please visit the websites following this seminar today to look at further details on that. And ACRS will also send out complimentary memberships for 3 months with weekly alerts. So keep an eye out for those. A bit of housekeeping today. If you would like to ask a question, please post that into the Q&A function rather than the chat function. Each speaker will run through their presentation, and there'll be time for Q&A after each session. Now, moving on to our first speaker. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. Marilyn Johnson. Marilyn is one of Australia's leading cycling safety research experts. She's a senior researcher at the Monash University Institute of Transport Studies, where she leads the Active Transport and Micro Mobility Group. She's also the research and policy manager at the Amy Gillett Foundation, and was a major contributor to the national campaign A Meter Matters that changed the road rules to improve safety when drivers and cyclists share the road in Australia. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thanks for that, Al. Hi everyone. I think this is going to work. Yep. Hi everyone. I'm just going to share my slides. Is that working? If someone can just let me know.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that. Okay, so thanks for that introduction, and thanks to AITPM, the Australasian College of Road Safety, and RACV for putting this seminar series together. When I was invited to talk about protecting vulnerable road users, I was asked to consider a question, and this was the question. Now that minimum passing distance laws are being implemented across Australia, what are the next important steps we need to take to protect bike riders? And it's an enormous question, and one that I can talk for far more than my 15 minutes. But before I get into it, I just wanted to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page in terms of approach to road safety. And I'm sure that we're all kind of coming from a safe system approach. It certainly underpins my own research and the work at the Amy Gillett Foundation, and that idea that at the very centre we are human bodies that are fragile and can't withstand huge force, and that means that when we make mistakes on the road environment, that environment needs to be forgiving, and that forgiving environment is the responsibility of all of us, both as users but also as people who I'm sure are watching today, whether you're designers or planners or involved in government in building and maintaining roads. And then there's the 4 pillars: the safe roads, safe speeds, safe people and safe vehicles. But my background's in social research and injury prevention, so this is not the only approach that I use. I also use Haddon's matrix. And while this is probably familiar to a lot of people, the key difference between the two is that Haddon's matrix has the element of time, which is in that first column. So looking at things for us in road safety would be about the crash. So a pre-crash, the crash and the post-crash are 3 different time periods. And then also looking across to the host, the vector, and the environment split into 2 groups, the physical and the social. And this is where my main research focus is, in that pre-event space. And it's not an either or, it's definitely an and it's quite easy to map the safe system approach across Haddon's matrix, and it lines up clearly in the host with the people, the vector or the agent being safe vehicles, and the physical environment covered off with speed and roads. But what's missing often in the safe system approach is that social component. And by social, it's much broader than just the individual, but it speaks to what that community attitude is. And that's particularly important for vulnerable road users, especially when we have the public discourse and the media that tends to either victimize or villainize cyclists, where cyclists are either the poor injured road user or they're the people who are being lawless on the road. And it's great to see that at the national level from the Office of Road Safety that the socio-ecological model is being introduced and talked about more recently, which brings in that social element. So that's kind of my approach to road safety, just so that I'm just clear about that. So coming back to the question, in terms of answering that, really the next step for me is a really general, broad, overarching point, and that is that we need to bring the community with us in whatever we do. And that's particularly the case for vulnerable road users. But rather than just be as general as that, I do have 5 key points that I'll quickly run through in answer to that question. And the first one is really the most basic and fundamental one to a safe system approach, and that is reduce speed limits. This is particularly the case in the urban road environment, where our default urban speed limit at 50 kilometres an hour is just too high. It's incompatible with that fundamental core part of the safe system approach. And reducing the urban speed limit down from 50 to 40, but ideally to 30, is really where we need to go. But of course, for us to get momentum in that space and to have the political will, we definitely need to have the community along with us. The second response to the question is around infrastructure. And if anything we've learned from COVID, there is opportunity around temporary separated infrastructure first to test where we should be putting infrastructure and to test what works. And that's absolutely been the case this year with COVID. This was a recent study that's come out this month from New South Wales and the government, a study that they did about public spaces, where they've shown that, that they've reported, we've all seen it, that people have changed the way they move during COVID. People are driving less, people were walking more, and people were cycling more. And so for all of the damage that COVID's caused this year, it really has created a natural experiment for transport, and we've seen mode shift. So in terms of what's next for road safety, we need to not just capitalise on this sort of what's been called a perfect storm of COVID, but more to learn from what other countries and some cities in Australia have managed to do. And so temporary infrastructure can be rolled out. This is an example from Sydney, where that really light, soft infra goes in, it's quick to install, it's easy to test. And then if it's working or not working, that can be decided from actual participation and use. It's that sort of testing the build it and they will come approach. But it's not just local. Obviously, the NACTO guidelines came out in May this year. This was really quick in response to lockdowns through COVID, about how to start to reshape and replan streets in soft ways and quick and cheap ways. And examples even from the US, where this doesn't need to be expensive measures. These are things that we can roll out quickly. And if anything this year, I think the appetite has changed too from the community that there seems to be a greater willingness to try things and to see if it works. And this definitely fits into that approach. The third thing is road rules to protect road users. Al mentioned at the start about minimum passing distance. And while that's almost been the case with the implementation still to roll out in Victoria, changes to road rules is so easy to say. To type those 5 words was so simple, and yet it is such a difficult process. So I just wanted to quickly just step back for a second and just tell you the quick story about minimum passing distance from the Amy Gillett Foundation perspective, because it's tangled and it's not an easy space. So for anyone on the seminar today who's not aware, the Amy Gillett Foundation was formed after Amy Gillett was killed in a crash in Europe in 2005. It was started by Amy's family and friends, and with a simple mission about achieving safe cycling in Australia. And that's for every person on every bike, for every trip type. And so what we knew back in 2008 was that we needed to do something quickly that would get us from where we were now to what that safe cycling environment would look like. And so we thought that a short-term goal was just to make sure that cyclists had a safe space around them. And that the longer-term goals of speed reduction and infrastructure that would take more time would be something that we'd do in parallel, but changing that road rule to make sure cyclists had enough room would be something we could do quite quickly. So the foundation had an education campaign from 2009 to 2013, and the road rule itself around minimum passing, or what passing distance cyclists would be drivers were required to give, was tested in a court in Brisbane in 2013, where after a fatality crash where a truck driver thought he had sufficient distance to pass a cyclist, he didn't. He hit the young cyclist who was killed. But even when tested in court, the intention that the driver had sufficient distance meant that he wasn't found in breach of that road rule. So that was when we decided that we needed to push for change at the foundation to change that road rule. And for anyone who's not quite familiar with what it is, the original road rule had this key word in it, that when a driver was overtaking a vehicle, including a cyclist, that they pass at sufficient distance. What that sufficient meant was where that ambiguity was. And for some drivers, it seemed that just passing and not hitting them was enough. But we felt that that wasn't clear enough for drivers to afford them the understanding of what was needed, but it also wasn't giving cyclists the space. So it's not a new road rule, it's just an amendment that specifies what that minimum distance is. So a lot of words there, basically it just means that it's 1 metre up to and including 60 kilometres an hour and 1.5 in speed zones higher. So in 2013, there was no road rule that specified that. There was just sufficient distance. It started to change after some parliamentary inquiries, and there was change in 2015. This then led to 2017, where there was a little bit more movement. But you can see that by this year, we had the announcement last month from the Minister for Road Safety, Minister Ben Carroll, that Victoria would change this road rule sometime in 2021. But that quick process that we had took at least 7 years. The whole campaign took 11 years. And I'm not going to show you the next slide for you to read, but this is just an example of the work that the Amy Gillett Foundation had to sustain across that time period. So we're talking multiple parliamentary inquiries, multiple trials, advice to steering committees, having these discussions over and over and over again nationally to make this one small change to the distance that cyclists would be afforded on the road. And there are complementary road rules as well, but really it was about each state wanting that proof for themselves and that timeline just getting longer and longer. So while it's easy to say, it's actually really difficult to achieve. The fourth one, just to keep moving, is that sharing roads with cyclists has to be included in driver licensing and training. In terms of what are the next steps to protect cyclists, that's a key gap in the way that we're producing drivers in Australia at the moment. And we know this because we've just finished a study called Cycle Aware with colleagues at University of Adelaide, Dr. Jennifer Bonham, who led this project, and Professor Narelle Howarth from CARS-Q. We reviewed all of the literature related to what a young driver, novice driver, will learn about sharing the roads with cyclists, what they will be given, the supervising drivers will be given. And what we found is that when it comes to cycling content in the driver licensing process, that it's really limited, it's inconsistent, it lacks explanation. It's often negative rather than informative. And some of the advice that's given can actually contribute to negative views of cyclists and potentially could legitimise views that cyclists are illegitimate road users, and that can create tension on the road. There's also the reality that at the moment you can get a driver's license in most states and territories in Australia and never be asked a single text question about cyclists. That's changing, but it definitely wasn't the case at the start of this study. So what we've done as part of that study is develop a learner driver module. So this is ready to be plugged in. We've tested it in South Australia and the Northern Territory. That has 12 short videos that shows a learner driver. If you were facing this everyday situation with a cyclist, you're asked the question, what would you do? And the video stops at a critical point in time. Then after the video, after they've responded, they are shown the rest of the video that shows the correct behaviour. And those different scenarios range across all of the normal things you would expect to see on the road, from entering the car to exiting, whether it's turning left or right, roundabouts, passing cyclists who are riding to abreast, wanting to turn. So that's another gap that we have. In terms of training, the other thing that the Amy Gillett Foundation has been delivering, this was developed in collaboration with the Victorian state government and the heavy vehicle industry, is sharing roads safely. This is a recognition that with all the big build projects going on in Victoria, we would have more and more truck drivers travelling into the inner city areas where there were high numbers of cyclists, pedestrians and motorbike riders. So this is based on international best practice. There's driver training program that's delivered through the Transport for London to their CLOPS program. And we've developed this so that it works for the Australian context. There's an online module, there's a workshop, and there's an on-road component where the truck drivers get out and have the opportunity to ride bikes. This sort of training is time consuming and it requires a lot of investment in both the driver, so the industry supporting it, but also in delivering it. But we're really seeing changes in the truck drivers. And this is something that they're actually coming off the bike and understanding cyclists in a way that they hadn't before. Just finally, and I'm sure I'm getting close to time, or might even be over time, but ANCAP 5 stars. This is the last point that I want to really raise with just about every group that I talk to, because there seems to be a disconnect at the moment with the community. This is a Skoda 5-star car. ANCAP provides fantastic information that helps people make decisions about the cars that they're choosing. So this Skoda 5-star, great. If you break that down and have a look in the occupancy protection, adult, children and vulnerable road user protections, you can see that they're rated quite highly. And when we look in detail at the vulnerable road user protection, you can see that for cyclists, it's 6 out of 6. So this is great. It's not so much when you look at some of the other vehicles that are being tested and coming back with a 5-star rating. So this Mazda, for example, this was rated 5-star and tested ANCAP this year. And yet when we look at the vulnerable road user protection in detail, you can see here that for cyclists, it's 3.87 out of 9. So it's not passing that minimum test for the cyclist protection. And it's not just Mazda. There's other vehicles in the class that are producing similar results in that test rating as well. And it's not just that class of vehicle, it's other SUVs as well. This one in particular, you can see there that the AEB for vulnerable road users for cyclists, the system doesn't react to cyclists, so it wasn't tested. So from a vulnerable road user perspective, this is not a safe vehicle. It's not a safe vehicle fleet to have increasing numbers of these cars on the road. And just my last point I just wanted to make while I'm here is that the question we really need to ask is, why don't we have 5-star cars on the road? And why do we have cars that aren't even making that 5-star rating across all of the different levels? This car, for example, from Jeep, the Gladiator, 3 stars. It failed even at a 50% rating across the vulnerable road user tests. And when you look at it here for both pedestrians and cyclists, there was 0 out of 6 scores. And that's because the vehicle does have an AEB, but it's not designed to react to either cyclists or pedestrians. So when you look at the safety guides for the people purchasing this car, and this is speaking to the community, the safety mention here is that it's got your front, back and sides. Well, it has your front, back and sides if you're in the vehicle, but not if you're a vulnerable road user outside it. So I think I'm at more than time, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your presentation, Marilyn. The outcomes seem like they're so simple to get to, but the road to actually get there is fraught with a lot of work. Now it appears that we don't have any questions, so you've covered off everything. If people can please post their questions into the chat, the Q&A function doesn't appear to be working, so we'll work through them. But as those start coming through, do you want to talk us through that process, that slide that you put up of the work that went on to actually achieve that Meter Matters, or the work that went into that campaign?
Yeah, I can see questions in the chat function, but I'll leave that for someone else to decide. Yeah, so it's really, I think the most frustrating thing, so there's two things I would say are frustrating about that sort of process when it comes to something like the road rules. And one is that there is a need for every state and territory to have the same evidence presented and the argument re-prosecuted over and over and over again. It doesn't seem to be a great level of, I don't want to say there's not trust, but there is a need for people to have things proven in their own jurisdiction as if it's the first time. And I can assure you that after 7 years of having similar discussions in every different state and territory, that they are the same issues that keep coming up over and over again. But it seems that there's almost like a snowflake approach every time, as if this is the brand new time and we have to prove it all over again. Worse than that, though, I think, is that there seems to be a different standard for vulnerable road user protection compared to vehicle occupant protection. We seem to have a default expectation that we'll be safe when we're inside our vehicles, but that somehow the standard of proof that's needed to have change for cyclists or motorcyclists, not so much pedestrians, but definitely for cyclists and motorcyclists, that standard is different and it changes. And they're the frustrations, but it really also, I think, highlights, the Amy Gillett experience highlights just how much time and commitment and dedication it's taken to achieve this outcome. And I'm the one sitting here presenting this today, but this has been an enormous number of people's work. I mean, at one point we had a petition to federal government that had almost 30,000 signatures. So to have that level of commitment and persistence, it's not something that every different area in vulnerable road user safety has. And I'm not so sure that it's a good thing that it's needed. I think some of the processes that we need to work through to achieve change need some revision and need some refinement so that we can make some of these changes faster.
Bring down those blockers. Now we have a question. Is sharing roads safely training used as a contractual procurement requirement?
Okay, so sharing roads safely at the moment, yes, for big build projects in Victoria, there's a requirement that truck drivers will complete some kind of vulnerable road user awareness training, and sharing roads safely is recognised as an option for achieving that. Unfortunately, at the moment, the minimum requirement is just module 1, which is online, and module 2, which is the classroom component. But the best practice we know from the UK experience includes module 3, which is the on-road component. And that's an experience that they've been delivering their version of the course for, I want to say 10 years. They've delivered the course over 100,000 times. And across their whole project of work that is clocked, so it's more than the driver training, but across that whole program of works, they've seen a 46% reduction in crashes involving heavy vehicles and vulnerable road users. So the CLOCKS project as a bigger program of work is something that there's discussion about bringing to Australia and having that accredited, and it's definitely something that we need.
Thank you. We have a question about a Meter Matters. So is there an update on the Meter Matters rule for Victoria? Someone thought that Victoria was one of the few states that haven't adopted this.
Yeah, so that was definitely the case until October this year. I know it was the 7th of October because that's my birthday. So I felt quite excited that was a nice present that I received. But the announcement that was made by the minister was that there would be an amendment to the rule in 2021. And I know that the Department of Transport is working at the moment on how that implementation process will work. So I don't have any more of an update than that, but that's the state in Victoria as I understand it.
Sure. In general, what about helmets? Given Europe's take-up of cycling, we would get greater community support for cycling if we could get more people cycling by removing the need for a helmet. Assuming that assumption is correct, if more people were cycling, then dropping speed to 30 would get more support. So would this be better overall?
Okay, helmets. You can barely talk about cycling in Australia without talking about helmets. So I've been doing research about cycling safety for about 13 years, and I've interviewed and surveyed thousands and thousands of people about their intention to cycle, whether they cycle or not. And this is quite separate from the biomechanical work and the statistical work that's being done, particularly by Jake Olivier at the University of New South Wales. But in terms of, just to speak directly to the question about participation, I've asked people who ride, would you ride more if you didn't have to wear a helmet? And most people say, oh, either they'll say no, definitely not, I'll always wear a helmet, or they say, oh, I might do a local ride to the shops. And then I ask, well, would you let your children ride without a helmet? And the answer is always no. And then the question, well, what age would you let your child ride without a helmet? And parents don't want their children to ride. And when we've asked people generally, what are the barriers to cycling, helmets don't even rate a mention. People are afraid to ride with cars. They're afraid of the speed of the car next to them. They're afraid of the fact that there's no separated infrastructure. They're afraid of the fact that drivers have got no idea about looking for them before they open car doors, and the fact that many of the bike lanes put them in the door zone. The list goes on and on and on about things that are preventing people who are afraid to cycle from getting on a bike. And the helmet's barely even mentioned. So I think it's a bit of a red herring to say if we suddenly just turn off that, then it will make everyone suddenly hop on a bike. It's not true. What does flick that switch is fewer cars on the road. And that's what we've seen during COVID.
Good answer. I think putting a simple helmet on, I think, why wouldn't you do it? It's going to protect you. What are the next steps to reduce the default speed limit? In my experience in local government, residents often wanted the speed limit in their street reduced to at least 40. So I think there is community support for at least their own street. What needs to be done to get this message across to the law changes and get them on board?
Yeah, Elle, we've talked about this because we had, I think the answer is that this is already happening around Australia. And we had, at the Victorian chapter of the College of Road Safety, we had someone from Mildura come down and talk to us about how they engaged community and had the speed limit in the town reduced and then had more uniform speeds outside of town. And there's also been similar work in Mornington Peninsula. And I'm sure that there are people who are listening to this seminar right now who could name others that have done it at a local government area. So it's happening. And I think it's really a case of learning from those case studies where it's worked, what people have done to bring the community along with them, and what's worked in terms of, is it about a lower speed zone that's consistent? Is it about there being sort of areas where the speeds are well known? I know that buffer speeds is also an issue, particularly going in and out of regional towns. So I think there's not one rule, but I think there's definitely enough examples of different areas that have done it, whether it's the city of Yarra in a metro area, whether it's regional towns that have done it. I think that's what we need to do, is to share those stories more widely so that people can understand it. And I think the key thing out of Mildura, if I remember rightly, and you can tell me if I'm remembering this wrong, but there was a really, there was a resistance to reducing the speed limit from the local government perspective until they engaged with community. They expected a huge level of resistance and they just didn't get it. The community were kind of like, yeah, let's just do it. So I think there's a gap between the perception of what we think the community want and what the community are actually quite willing to at least try or to accept.
I think we've got time for one more. So we're seeing loads of food delivery bike riders on the roads today. Some of these riders obey the rules and some don't. Most are on bikes which can travel at speed. So should there be a formalised training for food delivery bike riders before they start working for a working as a food delivery rider?
The shortest answer that I have for that is yes. The longer answer is that it varies a lot by company. So we've done some work at the Amy Gillett Foundation with Deliveroo, and they're definitely aware of this, and they do testing with their drivers before they sign them up to go out and do deliveries. So we reviewed their onboard process to see what their actual induction activities were, and they do have a series of sort of more theory discussions where they'll do things and go through the basic expectations of their drivers, but they also do an on-road review of how people ride. So they do have the provision when it comes to things like handlebar mounts for mobile phones, that they don't answer or hold their mobile phone while they're riding, that they don't ride against traffic or ride, where they're not supposed to ride. But I'm well aware that other companies do not do that. The other element that I think the question might be referring to is the bikes that are ridden by some of those food delivery people, and some of them are not, they don't meet the design standard. They do travel in excess of the speed limit, 25 kilometres an hour. And yeah, it's a problem.
Thank you, Marilyn. We might leave it there. So thank you so much for your presentation and for taking questions.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Ken Beer. So Ken is recognised as a world leader in motorcycle safety infrastructure. He's been an advisor to governments of Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and the USA, California, and Colorado on the topic. He managed the Victorian Motorcycle Safety Levy infrastructure program over a 3-year period with expenditure of over 30 million on motorcycle safety infrastructure, with an independently evaluated road safety benefit of 29% reduction in fatal and serious injuries for motorcyclists. Ken is a licensed motorcycle rider, accredited senior road safety auditor, qualified trainer and assessor, registered engineer, and passionate road safety advocate. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Elle. And good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely that we can do this online these days and everybody's comfortable with that. I'm going to share some slides as well, just like Marilyn did, as a bit of a way to structure a few topics. But there is absolutely no way we're going to get through everything I want to. I would love to talk about this topic for a very long time. So what I've done is I've chucked a little QR code up the top here, and if you just hover your camera over that on your phone, it'll connect you to my LinkedIn, and I want to continue the conversation with you. So please link yourself, and we'll continue to chat on some of these topics into the future, because they need a lot of discussion. Some of these, yeah, we really need to get into talking about this. I'm going to focus in on motorcycle safety, but the framework I'm going to put forward is equally applicable to other road users as well, be that cyclists, pedestrians, or even other vehicles. And what I'm going to do is a bit similar to what Marilyn just presented, is to sort of mash together the safe system assessment framework with the sort of overarching elements of the safe system, or pillars as some people often call them, and create this sort of hybrid Haddon's matrix, which I'll get to that in a second. But for those who haven't used the safe system assessment framework, it's an Australian document, and it's very much something that's quite kicking off around Australia and New Zealand as an assessment methodology for how anything infrastructure-wise aligns with safe system principles. And of course, the safe system, which Marilyn's introduced there very well, and I'm sure everybody online has seen, and has seen so many thousands of times that I don't need to explain that in detail. But I do, in a sense, need to explain it in a little bit of detail associated with that. Human bodies are vulnerable. Human tolerance to physical force when we consider motorcyclists. And I dare say that a lot less of you are aware of some of the injury curves for motorcyclists. Now, this is 2019 research, and for those who know Dr. Johan Strandroth, who was in Victoria for quite a bit of time, this is some of his research with colleagues out of Sweden, and it's looking at what are those injury curves for motorcyclists, because we have some curves for pedestrians, and I know there's more work being done on that. We have some cyclists curves, and Marilyn's been doing more work on that, and lots of stuff on cars. But we really didn't have too much on motorcyclists, and just made a guess that oh well, we'll just plonk them in with pedestrians and cyclists, and we'll lump all of that together as a vulnerable road user. And no, so we've managed to get these curves, which is a wonderful benefit to us. Now, they are a bit up from what we had expected in terms of those crash curves. And you can see there, these are the Maze 3, so the higher end serious injury and fatality. And you're seeing some of the sort of 25 death rate at somewhere around the 50 km/h for head-on crashes against a passenger vehicle. Impact with different barrier system types, any type of barrier there. We're seeing somewhere around the 25% is there in sort of that 25 km/h, and it sort of goes up from there. So this is important for us to understand, but the speeds motorcyclists are traveling out there and the speed of vehicles around motorcyclists is very far from what is, generally considered low risk within these curves. We're really quite a long way off that. So what I've done is this sort of, hybrid matrix of the safe system assessment framework thinking, and which is just a different risk assessment methodology, being severity, likelihood, and exposure to crashes as those elements that bring about risk, and then taken the elements of the safe system and plonked them as the columns there. So what I then did, and this is my take on things, and I'm sure others have very different takes on things, but is to shade each of those areas with our past effort and performance in that area when considering motorcycle safety. Green being fairly good, obviously yellow being medium, and red being really poor in terms of our effort and performance in addressing some of these areas. Now, I'll pop a few examples in there of what has been done to get this clear in your mind. And you'll see there that in the roads and roadside space, and having a quick look through who's attending, a lot of you play in the road and roadside space. So that's this will be quite familiar to you. And the severity of crashes in the roads and roadside space, well, we've done some things for motorcyclists, underrun protection on barriers, certainly things like roundabouts, which lower speed at conflict points, are very beneficial for the severity of impact for motorcyclists as well as other vehicles. Some frangible sign ranges to a degree, and different curbing types as well. The likelihood space is where we really have focused major energy, and we're doing things quite well there. And that's trying to stop the crash happening in the first place. And that's very laudable, something we really need to continue doing, but we have been focusing on that for a long time. And that's all our signage, line marking, delineation, different drainage, good road design, the cambers, signalization of intersection controls, and those sorts of things. The exposure, so that's actually being physically able to actually get to that crash. We've done, again, a few things in that. Things like median safety barriers, so other vehicles can't get into that position to strike a motorcyclist, and closing off intersections and the like. When we jump into the vehicle space here, we're seeing that some of the things have been done are really good stuff in helmet, in the severity space. I've included, the riding gear in that vehicle space. And there are lots of different gear coming out in terms of protective devices. Moto Cap's a wonderful new initiative, sort of star rating motorcycle safety clothing, or providing that rating for consumers. And auto emergency braking and those sorts of things are really helping out. Actually, that should be ABS. Anyway, the likelihood, again, some of those vehicle features that are making it much easier to control. It's helping out in a very big way in stopping the crash happening in the first place. So we've done decently well there. Exposure in a vehicle sense, really not too much. I'll come in to show you very shortly a few things we could possibly start thinking about. The people space in severity, generally, there not too much has happened. Maybe a little bit in the sense of trying to alert riders to the importance of helmet use, educate in terms of some of the gear to be worn and those sorts of things. So that's probably, a bit's been done in that space. So given it the yellow colouring there, and the likelihood space is where all this attention has been focused for the riders themselves in terms of training for riders, licensing, testing, and those sorts of things. And the idea of upskilling the rider, which is important, but it's one of these boxes of many that that we should be trying to utilize. The reason it's yellow is because I think there's a lot of the other road users, a bit like Marilyn said, who haven't been thinking about the needs of motorcyclists in their training and licensing and those sorts of things. Exposure, again, not much being done in that space, and that's really trying to essentially restrict where people would ride and when they would ride, when the risks are far beyond what we can accept. And then speed, and you see the speed is just all red. I mean, we really ignore that within the motorcycle space. It's better with other road users. We've still got a huge amount of work to do, but in general, it's been ignored in the severity, the likelihood, and the exposure sense for motorcyclists. So what I am sort of saying is just a few things, and I'm sure that lots of you out there have many other great ideas. A few things that I think could be injected in, and in the roads and roadside space, I suppose, big one to start with is some sort of principal motorcycle network, some sort of recognition of areas that motorcyclists are riding or we're going to encourage riding, and then thus some areas that we are not. And you know, the principles of a sort of smart roads or road use hierarchy or the like is fantastic. And why did we just ignore motorcycles? Are they not a legitimate road user group? Well, we give them licenses and we register bikes, but we sort of ignore them. And Marilyn's going to have to jump in to remind me of the term that's used of this. It's not a car, but we'll just sort of treat it as a car when we want. It's not a bike, as in a push bike, but we'll treat it sometimes like that if it suits us. And you know, it's ignored to a degree. And we may want to consider some of these things like motorcycle lanes, even if we have defined this principal motorcycle network and we're trying to encourage that use. That's where we can start investing in alterations, really considering motorcyclists. In the vehicle space, we've got things like mandating different energy absorbing safety gear, which I can show you some examples of shortly. Then minimum on vehicle safety features. So starting to weed out bikes that just do not meet those safety features, which we are going to need to do if we want to aspire to anything close to zero motorcycle trauma as it continues to rise. And in the speed, you know, in the people stuff, it's again speed management, licensing for drivers and training on the needs of motorcyclists and being aware. Also training for engineers on how to create road environments that are safer for motorcyclists. And then in the exposure space, where we're starting to look to restrict unsafe riding out there in terms of through our licensing or financial mechanisms, or where and when people choose to ride. And speed, I mean, there's huge rafts of ways we can start to genuinely address this, but speed limiters on motorbikes, I mean, we all have a dream of one day, you know, cars actually having some sort of speed limiters on them. And I note that the Europeans have started to put that in place or put the wheels in motion. But surely our highest risk road user out there can be subject to some speed limiting. I mean, really the ability to go these extreme speeds is unnecessary on the public road network, and it should be just put in place. And that goes the same with a number of different restrictions on riders. I'm not against riding at all. I'm a licensed rider. I'm not an active rider, I should say. But we need to all acknowledge, including riders, the risks at play. And we need to start putting in some genuine features there. And enforcement being another one, the ability to enforce. We must have a full ability to enforce motorcyclists like cars. And we don't quite have that at the moment without front identification. But maybe if that's completely unpalatable or politically unpalatable for some reasons, which I can't quite understand, but others out there explain that is the case, we can utilize the technology and start to monitor motorcyclists. Freedom is important. However, the safety of our community is more important in those senses. So there's just a little bit of a general overview, and I don't have too much longer to go, but I will jump into a couple of these to point out a few things. I'll probably jump to the vehicles one just to start with, but that severity in vehicles is something we, in the motorcycle space, are just starting to wake up to, and things like airbags for motorcycles, which are starting to become available, the inflatable safety vests, which are going to provide benefit, and those sorts of things are starting to become available. Electronic stability control and ABS braking and sort of ESC as well are things that the technology's there, and it's just about getting them further integrated into the fleet. So starting to really take that stuff seriously. In terms of the roads and roadsides, obviously our barrier system's getting some good severity style treatments with underrun protection. I haven't mentioned wire road barrier systems, so I'm sure that'll be a question that might pop up, and I'm happily going to dispel that myth when it pops up, that this is somehow more dangerous than other barrier types for motorcyclists. But certainly there are some energy absorbing safety features available for those. And little things like delineators. I mean, did anybody notice the change in delineators to the plastic delineator as opposed to the steel one? I mean, little changes like that are a severity change for motorcyclists. If a motorcyclist hits a barrier, slides along the top of it, they're no longer subject to that slicing of the metal delineator, the flexible delineator. So those sorts of changes are great. And there are lots of different energy absorbing products out there. I'll come back to that if anybody wants to talk more about that. I mean, we need to start utilizing the European crash tests for motorcyclists in a raft of infrastructure, not just say, oh, well, that road user group's too hard to deal with. Well, there is a European crash test for motorcycles that involves a dummy there at, well, it's a 60 km/h hit, but at least it's giving us something. And so there's some pictures of some testing out of Crash Lab New South Wales. I think little bits on the likelihood, highlighting our compound curves is a very important thing, and this is a wonderful sign. We should be putting that on all compound curves. They're especially hazardous for motorcyclists. Improving skid resistance, warning for motorcyclists, and as I talked about, like our infrastructure such as median barriers are going to have huge benefits for motorcyclists. Unfortunately, a lot of the motorcycle community is focusing on that as some sort of hazard for a motorcyclist, where that's doing a wonderful job in stopping other vehicles entering the motorcyclist lane. So huge benefits there for motorcyclists. And there you go, a little snip from, well, that's from Smart Roads, but isn't it? Priority traffic work, priority traffic route, tram priority route, bus priority route, pedestrian, bicycle, traffic. Well, there's no motorcycle whatsoever mentioned in there. And I'll keep just jumping through a couple of others. Sorry, I've done those. In terms of that people and enforcement, so we certainly want more ability to enforce, and that's just fair, isn't it? I mean, we've got the highest risk road user here, can go to the highest speed with the most vulnerability, and we have the least ability to enforce, well, beyond some of the cyclists and pedestrians and the like. But really, we've got to change that. But it's not about just those super high speed ones, the urban riders as well, and how do we enforce and cater for those activities. The Making Roads Motorcycle Friendly program's a great one for engineers and road designers and maintenance crews to understand the needs of motorcycles. We get them on a bike, and that's something that really opens up the eyes to some of these features that can be implemented into the road system that really assist. And the exposure for the rider, when and where to ride, we need to get a bit of clarity around that. Some sort of principal motorcycle network will aid us from a holistic management of the system perspective and where the investment on motorcycle friendly infrastructure goes. And then we have the ability to move some levers around once that's in place. And the speed and the enforcement I've talked about, just absolutely critical that we include motorcycles in our ability to enforce in a rigorous manner. And the speed limit reductions, they work. That may not be within the tolerance of the body of a motorcyclist, as we said, but it reduces the likelihood of crashes. And we may need to utilise our motorcycle network to understand where we'll be altering speeds and where we'll be investing in high level of motorcycle safety infrastructure. And certainly the ability to put in place those speed limiting mechanisms on this highest risk road user. And really the argument of freedom to be able to go 200 kilometres an hour is ridiculous. So I'll stop there, but I do encourage you to pop in your questions and we'll go to that. And also, as I said before, get onto that QR code and tell me all the things you're thinking in terms of issues for motorcyclists or things we could possibly do. So over to you, Elle.
Thanks, Ken. And that graphic that you threw up, that was incredible, just to paint that picture of where more work needs to be done. It's astonishing that speed is so red.
Well, that is my sort of opinion based on the career I've had in motorcycle safety, but I dare say some others will argue that there should be alterations to that. But I think it's a neat little framework for us to start to think about a motorcycle safety strategy for Victoria or for other jurisdictions, and start to legitimise this as a road user. And Marilyn, at some point, unmute yourself and tell us what that term is that the motorcyclists sort of sit in this. What are they? A car, or a bike? We'll just ignore them.
Do you mean the liminal zone?
I do mean the liminal zone. Thank you. That's
okay. Not quite road, not quite footpath, somewhere in the in-between. It's like not quite day, not quite night, dusk, that liminal zone where cyclists and motorcycles often sit.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Mary.
Now, we do have some questions coming through. So, is the motorcycle lobby's focus on wire rope barriers a distraction from some of the bigger safety issues facing motorcycle riders?
The phrasing of that question is perfect, because the answer is yes, yes, yes. It is an extreme distraction from the real issues. I mean, the research of Transport for New South Wales, Raf Jabieta and colleagues over a decade now, there has been an intense focus on understanding the risks of motorcyclists with barrier systems, okay? And what they discovered is motorcyclists are somewhere in the 20 to 25% of fatal serious injuries. And of that, about somewhere in the order of 5% of that is crashes involving barrier systems of some sort. And then within that, 2% would be involved with a wire rope barrier systems in its own right, giving us sort of like that 0.02% of trauma being motorcyclists and barrier systems. So, and wire rope barrier systems particularly. So even within the barrier category, we've got so much more that we need to be focusing our attention on. And then beyond that, look at all these other areas that we need to be focusing on before we get to that. So the attention being paid to wire rope systems as some sort of extraordinary thing is a bit crazy. And then the mechanics of it also, for the design engineers out there, will know that you cannot use a wire rope system on a curve radius more than 200 because it's too tight, and that's a barrier in tension, and you tension it up, it'll pop into the middle of the road. So we don't use it on popular motorcycle touring routes. It's used as a fatigue management device on long straight roads, and motorcyclists are not falling asleep and leaving the road like that. So the whole attention on this is actually actively distracting from a genuine conversation on some of the areas of motorcycle safety that would really genuinely give us big benefits for that road user type, being the speed, some of these vehicle features, the ability to enforce. And those are where we're going to get massive gains. So I get pretty passionately angry about this because so much attention is being focused on it, and it's just not good use of anybody's time and effort.
Thanks, Ken. Now we're running out of time very quickly. We might just have one more question. Sharing bus-only lanes with taxis and bicycle riders has been trialled for motorcyclists on some roads in Perth, but MRWA and DOT found it to reduce safety, not increase it. What is your understanding of these issues?
Okay, so it's being trialled in a number of jurisdictions. It's been, I suppose, legitimised in some other jurisdictions as well in terms of it's part of what can be done. And there has been mixed results across the world. We have seen some Transport for London improvements in safety with motorcycles in bus lanes, and we've seen some other jurisdictions with some alterations. There are design features that can be implemented into those bus lanes to improve them for motorcycles, and certainly like the Hoddle Street, we did a lot of work assisting in risk assessments and alterations to the infrastructure to give it the best motorcycle safety possible. In theory, some sort of separation is a good thing, but we need to consider those side roads, those access points, and the like. So it's a very complicated one. I think it can be done safely with very thoughtful design considerations and some investment in safety features for motorcyclists. It can be done fairly safely. We do need to think of the inherent risk that is placed by motorcyclists altogether. But something I think you need to take each case individually and re-engineer that road environment with motorcyclists very squarely in mind. It's not just a matter of just putting up a sign and saying motorcyclists allowed now and expecting you'll get big safety outcomes. You've got to actually really think about this and redesign it.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you so much for your time today. The conversation definitely isn't finished, but thank you very much for starting it. So we might leave it there for questions. So on behalf of AITPM, ACRS and RACV, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Marilyn and Ken for joining us today and running through their presentations on cycling and motorcycle riders. I hope everyone found the session valuable and has found something that they can take away in the work that they do and something that's useful. We will post a quick survey, a link to a survey in the chat. So please tell us what you thought about the session today. And we're also continuing this conversation next week. So details will be sent out shortly. Next week, we're focusing on safe roads and safe speeds. And please have a look at the membership for AITPM and ACRS and keep up to date with the information from these organisations and the latest news and opportunities that do come up. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and see you next week.